The first ranging left Castle Black on a morning when the sky above the wall was the color of old iron, the kind of sky the North produced when it wasn't threatening weather but simply declaring its nature. Jon rode out with 7 rangers and Ghost and 300 obsidian-tipped arrows in oilskin bundles across 2 pack horses. And he had the specific feeling of a man who had spent years preparing for something and was finally doing it, which was less triumphant than he'd imagined and more cold. Mormont had given him the ranging reluctantly, not because he doubted Jon's readiness. After 3 weeks at Castle Black, the Lord Commander had developed the grudging estimation of Jon that he extended to men who proved more useful than expected. He doubted because losing the king's representative north of the wall within a month of his arrival would be a political catastrophe that even Dragonglass couldn't compensate for, and Mormont had survived this long by not creating catastrophes he could see in advance. Jon had made the case plainly. The Dragonglass did nothing sitting in Castle Black's stores. The armorers knew how to shape it, but not how to test it. The ranging reports described encounters in specific terrain, at specific distances, with specific warning signs. And he needed to understand the terrain before the terrain understood him. Mormont had given him the ranging with the specific qualifier that Jon return alive. Jon had promised to make every effort. They rode north through the haunted forest, and the forest was the thing that the name couldn't quite carry. It was not haunted in the way that stories meant haunted. It was haunted in the way that places were haunted when they were very old and very empty, and the emptiness was not natural. When you were in a forest that should have had the noise of living things, and the noise was absent, and the absence was its own sound. The horses felt it. Ghost did not. The direwolf moved through the haunted forest with the ease of an animal that was in his element, which told Jon something about what Ghost was built for, and what the wall's north side was built to contain. On the second day, they found the campsite. It was Dalbridge's camp, one of the ranging parties that had gone out 7 weeks before and not returned. Mormont had written it off, the way commanders wrote off things they couldn't afford to grieve in the middle of still needing the men they had left. Jon had read Dalbridge's reports. He'd been a competent ranger, methodical, not given to dramatizing what he found. His last report described moving shadows at 300 yards in failing light, and the horses refusing to advance regardless of command. The camp told the rest. There were no bodies. That was the thing. They had learned from enough ranging reports to expect the cold killed, the animal taken, the simply lost. They had not quite internalized, despite the reports, the specific reality of what the Watch had been encountering, which was that the dead didn't stay dead, and bodies left in the north came back as something else, and the something else served the cold. No bodies meant the bodies had risen. Jon stood in the middle of Dalbridge's abandoned camp and felt the cold that wasn't the weather. The deep wrong cold that he had read about and that he now understood was not a temperature, but a presence. It had been here. Recently, the cold had been here. "We go back," one of the rangers said. A man named Stone Snake, who had survived more rangings than most, and who had the economy of a man who did not spend words unnecessarily. "We go back, and we tell the commander." "We go back," Jon agreed. "But first we test the obsidian. There's nothing here to test it on. Then we know where the fire went, and we know what the cold means, and we know that Dalbridge's camp is dead. That's what we came for." He looked at the abandoned fire ring, the overturned equipment, the singular absence of bodies. "We came to understand. We understand something now." They went back. Jon wrote Mormont's report that night, and then wrote a second letter to Robert through the channel Robert had established for exactly this purpose, the specific royal courier route that bypassed the small council and went directly to the king's hunting room. He described what he'd seen. He described the absence. He described the cold that wasn't weather. He asked for more armorers, for the smiths in Winterfell to be told what they were making and why, for the northern lords closest to the wall to be quietly briefed rather than dramatically announced. He wrote, "The Watch doesn't need people to believe in the dead. It needs people to be ready for them. Belief can come later. Readiness has to come first." Robert's response came in 12 days, which was faster than it should have been, which meant Robert had been waiting for exactly this kind of letter. The response authorized everything Jon had asked for, and added 2 things Jon hadn't. The authority to conscript men from the northern holdings for Watch service, without requiring the Watch's traditional recruiting methods, and a letter to Winterfell instructing Ned Stark to act as Jon's logistical support in the north. Ned's response to Robert's letter arrived 3 days after Robert's response to Jon's. It said, "I've been waiting for someone to ask." It said the granaries nearest to the wall would begin stockpiling within the month, It said Robb would ride the northern holdings and assess what each house could spare without stripping their winter stores. It said, "Tell me what you need." Jon wrote back with a list. The list was very long. It took him most of the night to write, cross-referencing the ranging reports and Aemon's accounts and the logistics documents he'd studied in King's Landing's library. By the time he finished it was almost dawn, and Ghost was asleep on his feet, and the wall outside his window was the grey of a sky before it decided what kind of day it would be. He sent the list. He began building what the list would produce. The Watch did not know what to make of him in those first months. He was not a brother. He had never taken the vows. Never worn the black as a sworn man, rather than a man wearing black for warmth. He was the king's representative, which was a title they didn't have a category for, which meant different men placed him in different categories based on what they needed from him. To the Lord Commander, he was a resource, and occasionally an irritant. The specific kind of irritant that produced results, and therefore couldn't be ignored. To the senior rangers, he was a young man with authority he hadn't earned through years at the wall, and who asked questions that suggested he knew more than he should. To the stewards and the builders, he was the man who had brought the obsidian and who kept asking for more resources, and who actually got them, which in their experience was a miracle that didn't require theological explanation. To the recruits, he was the man with the direwolf. Ghost had become, in the way visible things became fixtures at Castle Black, the symbol that contained multiple meanings depending on who was looking. To the experienced rangers, he was a reminder of the Old North, the North of the stories, which was uncomfortable for men who lived in the reality rather than the stories. To the new recruits, he was extraordinary without being threatening, which made Jon less threatening by association. Jon used this. He used everything. He had spent 2 years in King's Landing learning to use what was available rather than waiting for the ideal. And the Wall had fewer ideal resources than the Red Keep, but the same fundamental problem: getting people to do what needed doing before the thing that made it necessary had arrived to prove the necessity. The Watch had been trying to convince the realm that the dead were real for years. Jon had a different approach, which was to not convince anyone, and instead to arm everyone and tell them the arming was sensible regardless of what you believed about the dead. Dragonglass arrowheads were sharp and well made and cheap to produce once the armorers knew what they were doing. Nobody turned down a better arrowhead. The first serious test came in the late autumn of 300 AC, 6 months after Jon's arrival. A ranging party of 12 had gone out, and 8 had come back, which was better than the usual math. And the 8 who came back had done something that had never been reliably documented before. They had stopped one of the greater dead and confirmed the stopping. Not a standard white, something that moved differently, that seemed to direct the others. One of the cold things that the Watch's oldest reports called shadow men, and that Jon had come to understand, were the walker kind, rather than the turned dead. An obsidian blade driven through its core, and watched it shatter. The ranger who had done it was a young man named Ed. Dolorous Ed, they called him, for his outlook on life, which was comprehensively negative and delivered in a flat tone that made the negativity seem less like despair and more like accurate observation. He had not killed the white heroically. He had killed it because it was in front of him, and he had the knife, and the alternative was to be killed by it, which he had evaluated as a worse outcome. Jon read the report 3 times. Then he went to find Ed. He found him in the common hall, eating with the focus of a man who understood that food was fuel, and that fuel mattered more than flavor. Jon sat across from him, and Ed looked at him with the Ed look, the look of a man expecting the world's next delivery of something unpleasant. "You killed one," Jon said. "Killed is a strong word," Ed said. It stopped. Shattered, actually. Whether it was ever alive in the first place is a theological question I'm not qualified to answer. The obsidian blade. Through the center of it. It wasn't a white. I've seen whites. This moved like it was thinking. The eyes were bluer. Colder, he ate. When it shattered, the other ones retreated. Not ran. Retreated. Like they knew. "They're controlled," Jon said. "From somewhere. Someone is directing them. Or something." Ed ate. "I try not to think too hard about the something. It makes the eating difficult." Jon looked at his food. He thought about the reports, about the cold that wasn't weather, and the retreating whites, and the coordinating intelligence, and the ranging parties who went out and never came back, and whose bodies became the next ranging party's problem. He thought about the wall, which was not simply ice. He thought about what Aemon had said, built with something in its foundations. He thought about 8,000 years of that something holding, and about whether 8,000 years was a long time for something ancient to wait. "Tell me everything," Jon said. "Everything you saw." Ed told him. It took a long time. What Jon built from it over the following month was the first systematic account of White behavior that the Watch had produced. Not the dramatic reports, the individual encounters, but a pattern document, cross-referenced against 12 years of ranging reports that showed the cold moving south in a line, the White encounters clustering along that line, the retreating behavior when specific weapons were used, and the geography of where the encounters were and weren't happening. He sent it to Aemon. He sent a copy to Ned. He sent a copy to Robert. Aemon read it and sent back 3 pages of annotations from the histories, drawing specific parallels to accounts from the first long night that had been sitting in the Wall's archives for 8,000 years, and that had been, until this document gave them context, simply old stories. Ned read it and sent back a list of every northern holding within a day's ride of the Wall, and what each holding could provide in terms of men and material if the Wall's southern side needed resupplying during winter. Robert read it and sent back 2 things: a letter authorizing the construction of 3 additional ranger staging points south of the Wall, and another letter authorizing Jon to begin negotiating with the Wildling clans on behalf of the Crown. That last letter was the one Jon had been waiting for. The Wildlings were the part of the equation that the Watch had never fully solved. They were north of the Wall, and therefore the Watch's problem when they came south and tried to cross, which was their right in their own view, and a violation of the only law the Watch enforced in the Watch's view. The Watch killed them when it caught them crossing. The Wildlings killed Watch Rangers when they caught them ranging. It was a specific kind of war that produced no outcome except an ongoing attrition that weakened both sides. Jon had a different view. The Wildlings were moving south because something north of them was worse than the Wall. They were not migrating. They were fleeing, which meant they were the Watch's best intelligence on what was north of the Wall. They had been living with it for longer. They had been watching it build for longer. And they had a specific understanding of the dead that the Watch's occasional encounters couldn't match. He wrote to the Wildling raider, whose territory was nearest to the Wall's eastern section. A spearwife named Ygritte, who had been sending parties across the Wall for 2 years, and who had been captured twice and released twice because the Watch had found her more useful talking than beheaded. He did not write as a Watch official. He wrote as the King's representative. He wrote formally, in the style King's Landing had taught him. The style of a man who understood that dignity mattered on both sides of a negotiation. He wrote, "I am not writing to offer you a bargain about the crossing. I am writing to ask what you know about the cold. In exchange for your knowledge, I offer 3 things. Continued crossing toleration on the eastern section, food for this winter in the amounts you specify, and my word before the king that the Wildlings who come south ahead of the dead will be treated as refugees rather than raiders." Ygritte's response arrived in 4 days. It was 2 words in the old tongue, which Jon had been working at since arriving at the Wall, picking it up from the ranging brothers who had spent years beyond the Wall, and who knew enough of the free folk's tongue to trade warnings and insults, if not always to negotiate. The 2 words translated, approximately as, "We'll talk." Jon rode north of the Wall to meet her. Mormont spent an entire evening telling him why this was specifically the worst idea Jon had produced so far, which was saying something given the list of ideas Jon had produced. Jon listened to all of it, and then said, "I know the risk. I'm taking Ghost. If they kill the King's representative, Robert Baratheon will burn the Wildling lands. They know that. The King made it clear in the authorization letter, which I showed Ygritte's man. Mormont said, 'The King is in King's Landing, and you are north of the Wall.' Jon said, 'Yes.' That's the point. He met Ygritte in a frozen clearing 2 hours north of the Wall, in the grey morning, with Ghost at his side and 2 rangers within earshot who had been given specific instructions not to intervene unless Jon was actively dying, at which point it was probably too late anyway. Ygritte was not what he'd expected. He had built an image from the reports, the raider, the Wildling, the 2 captures and 2 releases, the pragmatist who'd sent parties south not for conquest but for resources. The image was accurate as far as it went. What it hadn't captured was the quality of her attention, which was the same quality Jon had encountered in the men who had survived the North long enough to become good at it. The attention of someone who had learned to read the world quickly because the world had teeth, and reading it slowly was how you got bitten. She looked at Ghost first. The direwolf. She looked at it the way people from north of the Wall looked at direwolves, which was differently from how Southerners looked at them. Not with fear or wonder, but with the recognition of something that belonged to the same landscape they did. He's not a watchwolf, she said, in the common tongue, accented but clear. She looked at Jon. The watch hasn't had direwolves in decades. He's mine, Jon said, from Winterfell. Stark wolf. She held his gaze. I heard about you. The king's bastard who isn't a bastard. The southern lord who came to the wall. Her voice was flat in the specific way of people who communicated through directness rather than courtesy. Why should I believe you mean what you wrote? Because I wrote it with the king's seal and in the king's name. And if I break it, the king loses credibility, and Robert Baratheon would rather drink poison than lose credibility. He held her gaze. I could be lying. You could decide I'm lying and we stop talking, and you go back to sending parties across the wall and losing people, and I go back to sending rangers north of the wall and losing people. Or you could decide I mean it, and we have a conversation about the cold. She held his gaze. The cold is coming, she said. Your people talk about it like it's a story. It's not a story. My people have been running from it for 2 years. 2 years before that, the dead started walking again in numbers. Before that, my grandmother told me stories her grandmother told her, and the stories weren't stories to them. They were warnings. She held the gaze. Your wall is 8,000 years old. The thing your wall was built to stop is older. Tell me what you know, Jon said. She told him. They talked for 4 hours in the frozen clearing, and what Ygritte gave him was more valuable than anything the Watch's reports had accumulated in a decade. Not because her information was more accurate, but because it was from a different angle. The angle of people who had been living adjacent to the thing rather than observing it from behind a wall. She described the cold's movement pattern in terms of specific landmarks that he could cross-reference against the Watch's maps. She described the behavior of whites in numbers. Small groups behaved one way, large groups another. And when the numbers got very large, the behavior changed again in a way that suggested the controlling intelligence was capable of coordination at scale. She described what the wildlings called the Night King, which was not what the Watch called it, but which was the same thing. The specific cold intelligence at the center of the dead's movement, the something that directed the nothing. Jon listened to all of it. When she finished, he said, "How many of your people are ready to come south?" She looked at him. "You mean it," she said. Not a question. Reassessing, I told Robert the wildlings were refugees. He agreed. The north has the space and the winter stores, because Ned Stark started building them 6 months ago. He held her gaze. I can't take all of you, not this winter, but I can take the ones the cold is closest to. The ones who come across the wall in the eastern section before the dead reach it. They come as guests of the north, not prisoners of the Watch. Ygritte looked at him for a long moment. Mance will want to talk to you himself, she said. Tell Mance I'm here, Jon said. Tell him what I offered. Tell him I brought dragonglass, and that the obsidian works, and that the south is starting to believe it, and that this winter is going to be different from the last 10,000 winters, because for the first time in 10,000 years, there is someone on the wall's south side who is actually paying attention. He held her gaze. Tell him I want to meet. She was quiet. You're very young to be making promises this large, she said. I know. Jon held her gaze. I'm also the only person making them. She left. Ghost watched her go. Jon stood in the frozen clearing and let the cold settle around him, and thought about the conversation with Aemon the night before, in which Aemon had said that the wall had been waiting for someone sent for the right reason who came for a different one. He was still coming to understand what that meant. He was beginning to think it meant the right reason was the dead, and the different one was everything else. Lyanna, Robert, King's Landing, the legitimacy and the dragonglass and the 100 men. He had come for his mother's memory. He had arrived for the dead. He went back to the wall. He wrote 3 more letters. The winter of 300 to 301 Ak was the winter that changed the shape of things north of the wall, though the shape wasn't visible from the south and wouldn't be for another year. Jon spent it building. Not the physical building. That was Ned's project and the Watcher's project and the Armorer's project, but the relational building, which was what King's Landing had prepared him for, and what the wall had not previously had anyone to do. He built the relationship with Ygritte's people into a genuine intelligence network, the first time in the Watch's history that the wildlings north of the wall had functioned as allies rather than adversaries. He built the relationship with Mormont into something closer to a partnership than the Lord Commander was comfortable with, but that produced results Mormont was unwilling to abandon. He built the relationship between Castle Black and Winterfell into the specific operational connection that allowed the North's resources to flow north without requiring the Watch to beg for each shipment. Robb Stark rode the Northern Holdings that winter. Jon had asked him to, in one of the letters, not formally, the way the Watch asked for things, but directly, the way brothers asked for things. He had described the scope of what was building, and what would be needed, and why the Holdings needed to hear it from a Stark rather than from a Watch Raven that could be ignored. Robb had done it with the specific Robb quality of arriving in a place and becoming the person the place needed. He came to each holding not as a lord commanding, but as a young man explaining, which was harder and rarer and more effective. He came with Jon's document, the systematic account of white behavior, cross-referenced and clearly written. And he let the document do the believing, and he did the planning. By the end of that winter, 7 Northern Holdings had agreed to pre-position food and weaponry within a day's ride of the Wall. Not because they believed in the dead, because Robb Stark had sat at their fire and been honest about what he knew and what he didn't know and what he was asking. And the North had always responded better to honest uncertainty than to performed confidence. The politics of the South had not stopped because the North was building. Jon learned this in the way people learned things they didn't want to learn, which was by receiving a letter that forced the learning. The letter came from Varys through the Royal Courier Channel in the winter of 300 to 301, 9 months after Jon had arrived at the Wall and while Robb was riding the Northern Holdings and the obsidian production was increasing. The letter said, Stannis Baratheon has left Dragonstone. He is traveling the realm. His stated purpose is inspection of the Crown's defenses. His actual purpose is the letter he sent you after the announcement. The one where he told you the renouncing is not binding. He is building the case for his own succession, and he is using your existence as the lever. Every lord he visits receives a version of the argument the Targaryen heir has renounced, but renouncing is legally impossible, which means the succession remains in question, which means Joffrey's claim is permanently compromised, which means Stannis as Robert's legitimate brother is the stable solution to an unstable situation. Jon read this twice. He wrote 2 letters. The first was to Robert. Stannis is leveraging my existence against Joffrey. You should know. The legal argument is correct. Stannis is right that the renouncing doesn't make the claim disappear. What you need from me is not a second renouncing. What you need is a public demonstration that the person making the claim has no interest in exercising it, which is what I've been providing from the Wall. The lords who see me here, working, building, focused entirely on the dead, those lords don't see a Targaryen claimant. They see a man who chose the Wall over the throne, and that choice is more persuasive than any legal document. The second was to Stannis directly. He had never written to Stannis before. He had read Stannis' letter, the 4 precise lines about the renouncing being on the record, and he had understood exactly what they said and exactly what they didn't say, and exactly what Stannis was doing with the record. Stannis was not plotting. Stannis did not plot. Plotting implied subtlety and concealment, and Stannis was incapable of either. Stannis was simply stating what he believed to be true, and allowing the truth to work on the world at its own pace. Jon wrote, Lord Stannis, you are correct that the renouncing does not make the claim legally void. You are also correct that the record exists and will exist. What I want you to understand is not the legal position, but the practical one. I am at the Wall. I have been at the Wall for 9 months. I will be at the Wall for the remainder of whatever years I have. The claim I carry is the same claim I carried in King's Landing. It has not grown or contracted based on location. What has changed is this. I have seen the Colds advance. I have seen what is coming from the North. And I am telling you that the succession question is the least important political question in the 7 Kingdoms right now, and that the man who helps me answer the Northern question before it becomes unanswerable is the man I will spend the rest of my life supporting in whatever role he chooses afterward. He paused. Then he wrote, The Wall needs Dragonstone's obsidian. It has always needed it. You have been sitting on the realm's greatest natural weapon against the dead for 30 years, and the small council has been dismissing the Watch's requests for access to it for the same 30 years. I am asking you directly, help me arm the Wall, and I will give you something worth more than a throne. I will give you the specific gratitude of a man who does not perform gratitude, but means it. And the knowledge that when the dead came for the realm, it was Stannis Baratheon who provided the weapon that stopped them. He sent both letters. Robert's response was characteristic, I'll manage Stannis. Keep building. Stannis' response arrived 3 weeks later. It was longer than his previous letter. For Stannis, it was almost warm. It confirmed that Dragonstone's obsidian deposits were available to the Watch without restriction, that a quarrying operation could begin immediately, and that the Dragonstone garrison would provide transport. It also said, in the final paragraph in the Stannis style of saying the important thing last and without flourish, "You are the only person who has ever written to me as though I were a practical problem to be solved, rather than a political obstacle to be managed. I find I prefer it. The obsidian will arrive before winter." The obsidian from Dragonstone arrived in 3 shipments before the winter of 300 to 3-1. It doubled the wool's supply. It also solved a political problem that Jon had not fully anticipated, which was that Stannis now had skin in the wool's success. He had invested material and reputation and his personal attention, and a man who has invested in something does not easily abandon it. Stannis' letters to the realm's lords after the Obsidian Agreement changed register. They still contained the argument about the succession. They now also contained, separately, information about the wall's preparation and the dead's advance that was not widely known, and that, coming from Stannis Baratheon, who was not known for exaggeration, produced the effect of facts being received as facts rather than watch politics. Stannis was making the case for the dead's reality without meaning to. This was exactly what Jon needed, and he had not thought to ask for it. He wrote to Varys, "Thank you for the Stannis letter. He's become an asset." Varys wrote back, "He's been an asset since the Obsidian Agreement. I noticed you managed that very cleanly." Jon wrote back, "I asked him for something he could give, and gave him something he valued more than the thing he thought he wanted. You taught me that in the Red Keep library. It took me 2 years to find the application." Varys did not respond to that. Jon was fairly sure the silence was Varys' version of being pleased. Mance Rayder came to the wall in the spring of 301 AC. He came across the eastern section, where Jon had established the tolerance, and he came without his army, just himself and a handful of men, and the specific presence of someone who had once worn a black cloak, and who had made the choice that Jon had come close to making, and had never quite been able to explain to the South's satisfaction. He stood in the yard at Castle Black, and he looked at the wall, and he looked at the dragon glass on the table that Jon had set out, and then he looked at Jon. "Ygritte said you were young," Mance said. "I am. She said you were honest. I try. She said the direwolf was real and not a story." He looked at Ghost. "It's real. He is," Jon said. Mance sat down. They talked for 2 days. What Mance gave Jon that the ranging reports and Ygritte's intelligence had not was scale. The wildlings north of the wall numbered over 100,000 people spread across the territories between the wall and the lands of Always Winter. Not all of them were moving south yet. But the ones closest to the cold, the ones who had been living in the shadow of the dead's advance for 2 winters, numbered roughly 30,000. And 30,000 people crossing the wall at once, even across the eastern section Jon had designated as toleration territory, was a logistical and political problem that the North was not yet positioned to absorb. Jon wrote to Ned. He wrote, 30,000. "We need to plan for 30,000 coming over the winter if the cold advances as fast as Mance believes it will. Not at once, in groups, over months. But 30,000. Ned's response took 4 days and contained a single line at the top, 7 hells. It then contained, in Ned's careful hand, a plan. The plan used the northeastern holdings, the ones closest to the wall. The ones with the lowest populations and the most space and the least political resistance to change as the initial reception points. It distributed the wildlings not as a group, but in the way large groups of people were made manageable, which was by making them smaller and spreading them across existing communities where they could contribute rather than accumulate. The North had lost people to the cold and the hard winters over the past decade. The northern villages needed labor. The wildlings needed winter shelter and food. The arithmetic worked, barely, if everyone agreed to it. Getting everyone to agree to it was the problem. Ned handled the lords. Jon handled the wildlings, the specific division of the problem that their 2 different skills produced. Ned in the Great Halls, making the argument for why the North would absorb people it had always treated as enemies, and Jon north of the wall, making the argument for why the wildlings should trust a wall they had always tried to get around. Both arguments were hard. Both required the specific credibility that came from being the kind of person who meant what they said. It helped that the dead were advancing, not quickly. The dead were patient in the way that cold was patient. They moved when they moved, and stopped when they stopped, and the pace was not a human pace, not a military pace, but the pace of something that did not need to hurry because it did not believe the other side could stop it. but they were advancing. The cold line was 3 days' ride north of the wall at the start of winter, 2 days' ride by the middle of it. The ranging parties Jon sent out, always in groups of 12 now, always with obsidian, always with the specific instruction to test and document rather than engage, confirmed the movement in every report. Ed confirmed it most succinctly. He had become the person Jon sent on the rangings that most needed accurate and unglamorous reporting, which was all of them. He came back from the ranging in the 3rd month of winter with the report that the cold's front edge was now 1 day north of the wall in the northeast sector. 1 day, Jon said. Give or take, Ed said. Cold moves faster at night. Slower when the sun's on it, though that might be my optimism talking, and I try not to give my optimism too much authority. Jon stood at the wall's top that night and looked north and saw the specific darkness that wasn't the absence of light, but the presence of something else. The cold and the wrong and the enormous patience of the thing that had been building for 10,000 years, and that was now, for the first time, building toward a wall that was actually prepared. He wrote to Robert. He wrote, "It's coming, not this winter, but next, or the one after. The cold is 1 day north of the wall. We have dragonglass on every ranger and obsidian blades being made in 7 northern smithies. We have 30,000 wildlings coming over the wall this winter in organized groups to the northeastern holdings. We have the watch at 800 men, up from 300 when I arrived. We have food for 2 winters in the wall stores and food for 1 more in Winterfell's and the connected holdings. We need more men. We need the South to understand. I need you to send Joffrey north." That last line was the gamble. He had been thinking about it since the conversation with Mance, when the scale of what was coming had become clear. The South did not believe. The small council did not believe. Tywin Lannister absolutely did not believe. And Tywin Lannister's opinion of the credibility of threats shaped how the realm allocated its resources. What the South needed was not more reports. What the South needed was the king's heir standing on the wall and seeing the wrong cold with his own eyes and coming back and telling lords who respected rank what a first-hand account of the dead looked like. Joffrey had promised to send what was needed. Jon was asking him to come instead. Robert's response came in 10 days. It said, "No, not Joffrey. Cersei would bury me before I finished the sentence." Then it said, "I'll come myself." Jon read that and sat with it for a long time. Robert Baratheon at the wall. Robert, who was the largest and loudest thing in any room he entered, who believed in things that were in front of him, and who had been told for 2 years by the man he trusted most in the north that the dead were real. Robert, whose authority was still the most significant single political force in the 7 kingdoms, despite 15 years of mismanaging it. Robert at the wall would not convince Tywin. It would not convince Cersei. But it would convince the lords who were loyal to Robert personally, the ones who followed the man rather than the crown, and there were more of those than the small council liked to acknowledge. Jon wrote back, "Come in the spring. Come before the cold advances again." Robert came in the spring. He came with a company that was smaller than a royal progress, but larger than a hunting party, 50 men, his master of horse, and Sir Barristan Selmy, who came because Barristan Selmy did not permit the king to travel to the edge of the world without the Lord Commander of his Kingsguard. Robert came up the King's Road with the specific Robert forward momentum of a man who had made a decision and was executing it before he could reconsider, and Jon met him at the Wall's Gate with Ghost beside him, and the specific feeling of a man who had spent 18 months building something and was about to show it to the person who had made the building possible. Robert looked at the wall. He had seen it before, when he was young. He had traveled north after the rebellion, in the years before the crown had finished burying him. But that had been a different man looking at it with different eyes. A young man for whom the wall was an enormous, impressive monument rather than a necessity. He looked at it now with the eyes of a man who had been reading Jon's letters for 18 months and who had been building a different understanding of what the wall was for. "It's bigger than I remembered," Robert said. "The threat got bigger," Jon said. "The wall didn't." Robert looked at him. "You've gotten grimmer," Robert said. "The North does that. The North, or the job." He looked at Ghost. "The wolf's bigger too." "Everything north of the neck grows larger than it should," Jon said. "Come inside. Mormont wants to brief you." Mormont's brief was thorough and undramatic. The Lord Commander had learned, in 18 months of watching Jon manage the relationship between the Watch and the outside world, that the dramatic approach to the Dead's advance produced disbelief rather than preparation, and that the methodical approach produced the opposite. He laid out the maps. He showed the cold line. He showed the ranging reports cross, referenced with dates and locations. He showed the white encounter accounts and the obsidian effectiveness data. He showed the wildling movement patterns and what they communicated about the dead's advance pace. Robert listened to all of it. He asked the specific Robert questions, which were blunt and physical. How many of them? How fast? What kills them? What doesn't? What does the wall stop? And what can the wall not stop? Mormont answered them. Then Robert said, "Take me up." They went up the wall. The lift, the slow mechanical ascent, 700 feet of ice with the wind increasing as you climbed, and the world shrinking below you and the north opening above. Robert stood at the wall's top and looked north, and he was quiet in a way that Robert was not usually quiet. The specific stillness of a man who was seeing something that required the full force of his attention without leaving room for anything else. The cold was there. It was not dramatic. From the wall's top, it was not a tide of bodies or a wall of ice or any of the images that the stories produced. It was a darkness in the north that was too dark for the season, a specific quality of the wrong cold that settled over the landscape beyond the tree line. And if you'd never been told about it, you might have thought it was cloud shadow or a weather peculiarity. But Robert had been reading Jon's letters for 18 months, and Robert had spent his life going toward the things that other men backed away from, and he stood at the wall's top, and he looked north, and he believed it. "How long?" Robert said. "Mance says 1 winter," Jon said. "Maybe 2. The cold's movement has been consistent. If it stays consistent, it reaches the wall in the winter of 302 or 303. And the wall stops them. The wall slows them. I don't know if it stops them indefinitely." Jon held the gaze. The wall was built for this. Something in its foundation responds to the cold. Aemon says the magic is real, not metaphor. But the cold's intelligence is looking for ways around. That's what the wildlings moving east and west mean. The cold is testing the wall's length for weak points. Robert looked along the wall's top in both directions. "It's very long," Robert said. "Castle Black alone can't defend it all. No single garrison can." Jon held the gaze. "That's what I need from the south. Not belief. Men. And the ones I can't get from the south, I can get from the wildlings if you give me the formal authority to offer them what they need." What do they need? The land south of the wall. Not given to them, shared. The northeast holdings are underpopulated and winter-stricken. The wildlings who come south aren't raiders. They're refugees from the dead, and they fight the dead better than anyone the Watch has ever trained, because they've been doing it for 2 years without walls or obsidian. Jon held the gaze. "Give me the formal authority to offer them the northeast as settled territory in exchange for service against the dead. Give Mance Rayder a title. Give his people a reason to fight on our side, rather than simply running past us." Robert was quiet. "That will not be popular," Robert said. "No, the lords who hold land adjacent to the northeast will argue their rights. The lords who hold land adjacent to the northeast lost people to this winter and need labor and defense more than they need to argue about wildling settlements." Jon held the gaze. "I've already spoken to 2 of them. Privately, they're not opposed. They're afraid, and afraid men are flexible." Robert looked north. He stood at the wall's top with the wrong cold visible to the north, and Jon beside him and Barristan Selmy at his back, and he did the specific Robert thing of making a decision by deciding he'd already made it, and now was simply executing it. "Write the authority," Robert said. "Send it to me and I'll seal it." And he stopped. "I'm going to send Joffrey north. Not now. In 6 months. When the weather allows, and when Cersei has had time to be managed about it." He looked at Jon. He needs to see this. He needs to stand where I'm standing and understand what he's going to be king of. He held the gaze. "Make sure he survives it." "I'll make sure," Jon said. Robert looked at the wall. "She could have loved you," he said. Suddenly, unexpectedly, the specific Robert direction change that arrived when something was thinking itself without announcement. "Lyanna, looking at you now, you're exactly what she would have wanted. Someone who goes toward the thing rather than away from it." He held the gaze. She'd have been insufferably proud. Jon held the gaze. "Good," he said. Robert laughed. The full Robert laugh, the specific sound that had made him beloved for 30 years in a city that didn't love anything without a gender. "Yes," he said. "Good." He turned from the wall's edge. "Come, I want to meet this Mance Rayder." They went down. The meeting between Robert Baratheon and Mance Rayder was not what either man expected of the other. Mance had expected a king who performed kingship, the southern style, the formal distance, the managed encounter. What he got was Robert, who sat down across from him in Castle Black's common hall with a cup of ale and no ceremony, and said, "You've been fighting the dead for 2 years. Tell me what I need to know." Mance had expected dismissal. He had expected the thing that the Watch had always given the wildlings, which was the formal position that they were enemies of the realm, and everything that followed from that position. He had not expected a king who treated the briefing as a briefing rather than a performance. Robert had expected a raider. He had expected the wildling of the stories, rough, unsophisticated, dangerous in the specific uncomplicated way of people who had never had to be anything else. What he got was a man who had once worn a black cloak, who had been educated by the Watch before deserting it, who had spent 2 decades leading 100,000 people through conditions that would have broken a royal army in a season. They talked for 3 hours. What Robert took from it, Jon could see it happening in real time. The specific Robert recalibration that occurred when he encountered something that proved bigger and more serious than he'd allowed himself to fully believe. Robert had believed Jon's letters. But believing letters and sitting across from the man who had been living with the dead's advance for 2 years were different levels of belief. And Robert, for all his faults, was capable of updating. He left Castle Black the next morning with Mance's full account in his head and the Robert expression of a man who had just understood something he wished he didn't have to understand. He did not make speeches. He did not declare the realm mobilizing. What he did was pull Jon aside before mounting and say, quietly, in the Robert quiet that was the inverse of his usual volume, "Everything you asked for. Write the list. I'll see it done." Then he rode south. The authority to negotiate with the wildlings came with the king's seal within 3 weeks. The authority to conscript from the northern holdings followed. Joffrey's visit was announced for the following spring, which was both better and worse than immediate. Better because it gave Jon time to prepare. Worse because it gave Cersei time to object. Which she did. Comprehensively and in multiple letters that Jon read at the wall, with the specific understanding that Cersei's objections were not going to change the outcome, but were going to make the outcome harder to achieve. What changed Cersei's position, ultimately, was not Robert, and not Jon, and not any argument from any direction. What changed it was Joffrey. Joffrey wanted to go. He had written to Jon 3 times since the departure, the letters increasingly urgent in the specific Joffrey way that urgency expressed itself. Not through emotion, but through the accumulation of practical details. The letters of a boy who had decided something and was building the case rather than simply asking. He had written about the Watch's funding, which he had quietly increased from the Treasury in ways that the small council would notice only retroactively. He had written about the ranging reports Jon had sent him, which he had read and annotated in the margins with questions that showed he had understood them. He had written, in the last letter, "Mother says I don't need to go. She's right that I don't need to, but the king goes to the places that matter. Father went. I should go." That last line, "The king goes to the places that matter," was the line that Jon recognized as his own, distorted by time and distance into something that had become Joffrey's rather than borrowed. He had said something like it 2 years ago in the training yard, and it had evidently been in Joffrey's head since. Cersei let him go, not because she agreed, because she had looked at the letter and looked at her son and understood that the boy who had written it was not the boy she had been raising for 12 years, but something better than the boy she had been raising, and that whatever was better in him had come from the 2 years he had spent learning from the northern ward who was now standing on a wall at the edge of the world. And that fighting it would cost her something she didn't want to pay. Joffrey came north in the spring of 302 AC. He came with a proper escort and Sir Meryn Trant, who had not been Joffrey's choice of Kingsguard companion, but who was the choice Cersei had made. And he came the way he came to most things now, with questions written out in advance, and the awareness that his questions were the thing that would teach him more than any briefing. He was 15. He had grown in the 2 years since Jon had left the Red Keep, physically, obviously, but in the other way too, the way that Jon had been watching for from a distance through the letters. The Joffrey who arrived at Castle Black was not the Joffrey who had come to his rooms at the Red Keep to evaluate him. That Joffrey had been a boy practicing how to be dangerous. This one was a boy who had decided to be capable instead. Jon met him at the gate. Ghost was at his side. Joffrey looked at the direwolf, and then at Jon, and then at the wall behind them, the full sight of it. 700 feet of ice. Enormous. Impossible. Real. And for a moment the political training and the learned composure dropped, and he was simply 15 years old, standing at the edge of the world for the first time. "It's very tall," Joffrey said. 700 feet, Jon said. "Come, you'll sleep first and see everything after." The cold exhaustion at this altitude is real, and it makes people make worse decisions. "I'm not tired. You will be." Jon held the gaze. "One night. Then we start." They started the next morning. Jon took 3 days with Joffrey and gave him the same progression he had given Robert: the documents first, the maps, the ranging reports, the systematic account of white behavior, but with additions that he hadn't had for Robert's visit, because in the year since Robert's visit things had moved. The wildling settlement in the northeast had begun. The watch was at 1,200 men. The obsidian production from Dragonstone had increased to a level that allowed every man in the watch to carry 2 blades and a dozen arrows. 3 new staging points south of the wall were operational, and Ed had led a ranging party that had encountered a white walker at close range and confirmed something that the old texts described but that no living man had verified: that Valyrian steel did to them what obsidian did, but more efficiently. Ed had not had Valyrian steel. No one at the wall did, except Jon. But his report was precise about what he had seen: another ranger attempt with a Valyrian blade taken from a dead lord's collection. And the attempt had worked. Jon carried Longclaw to every ranging. Joffrey read the reports. He asked questions that were better than Jon had expected. He was particularly interested in the logistics, not the battles, the supply. He had been watching his father and Tywin manage the realm's resources, and he had developed the specific interest of a person who had seen that wars were won and lost on supply before they were won and lost on courage. He asked about the food stores, the weapons production rates, the wildling integration timeline, the Watch's recruitment. Numbers versus the wall's length. On the 3rd night, on the wall's top, he asked the question that Jon had been waiting for since he'd arrived. "What do you need that you don't have?" Jon had been thinking about the answer to this question since the moment he'd heard Joffrey was coming. "Dragon steel," Jon said. "Or Valyrian steel. In quantity. The obsidian works, but it's fragile. A blade breaks on impact, and you have 1 chance. Valyrian steel doesn't break. The wall has enough obsidian to arm every ranger twice over. It doesn't have enough Valyrian steel to arm anyone except me." He held Joffrey's gaze. "The old families of the realm have Valyrian steel in their vaults. Swords, daggers. Some of them don't know what they have, because the knowledge of why the steel matters has been lost to them. I need those blades at the wall." "You want me to ask the great lords to give up their Valyrian blades?" "No. I want you to make them understand that the blades are more valuable here than in their vaults. Some of them will agree, others will need the right argument." Jon held the gaze. The Crown asking is different from the Watch asking. When the Watch asks, it's the Night's Watch, which is the end of a man's family line, asking for a favor. When the Crown Prince asks, it's the future of the realm making a case. Joffrey was quiet. The wall. The Roncoal to the north, visible tonight as a thickening of the darkness at the horizon. The world very large, and very cold, and very serious. "I'll ask them," Joffrey said. "When I get back. I'll go to the lords personally and I'll ask." He held Jon's gaze. "Some of them will say no." "Some of them," Jon agreed. "Ask anyway. The ones who say yes might save more lives than an army." The wildling integration did not go smoothly. Nothing involving 30,000 people ever did, and Jon had known this before it started, and had planned for the friction, and the friction had still surprised him with its specific forms. Not violence. The northeastern holdings had absorbed the wildlings without the violence that the southern lords had predicted and that Jon had feared, partly because the wildlings who came south were exhausted from 2 years of running, and partly because hunger and cold produced a specific pragmatism in people that overcame the barriers that comfortable people maintained. The friction came from the northern lords who were not in the northeast. Lord Karstark had objected. Not violently, not openly. Karstark was too careful for open objection when the king's authority was behind the policy, but in the specific way that powerful men objected to things they disliked, which was through the steady accumulation of complications, delays, lost shipments, unavailable. Men when men were requested. The specific institutional friction of someone who was technically cooperating and practically not. Jon had expected Karstark. He was not the only one. 3 other northern lords had juiced variations of the same friction, each calibrated to their specific position and their specific grievances about wildling settlements and what they communicated about the North's future. Ygritte handled 2 of them. This was something Jon had not anticipated, and that had emerged from the specific egret quality of being far more politically capable than anyone who hadn't spent time with her would assume. She had not become less herself in the 2 years since their clearing meeting. She was still direct, still northern in the specific wrong north way that made southerners uncomfortable. Still capable of saying the thing that needed saying without the diplomatic cushioning that the North's lords used as padding. But she had also become, in the specific way that people become things when they are given responsibility and exercise it, a political figure, not by title. She had no title. The integration protocol Jon had designed had deliberately avoided creating titles for wildling leaders on the grounds that titles created hierarchy, and hierarchy in the wildling community created resistance from the people who weren't at the top of it. She was a political figure by the weight of what she said, and the accuracy of it, and the specific quality of being right in front of people who had reasons not to listen to her. She rode to Lord Glover's holding with a letter of introduction from Jon and 6 of her people, and the specific agenda of demonstrating that the wildlings in the northeastern settlements were producing what they had promised to produce, which was labor and defense, and the specific intelligence about the cold's advance that only people who had been living adjacent to it could provide. Glover was a pragmatic man. Glover had been skeptical of the wildling settlement from the start, but had cooperated because Robb Stark had asked him to, and because the Stark asking carried weight. He had cooperated while waiting for the thing that would prove him right to have been skeptical. Ygritte gave him the winter harvest numbers from the northeastern holdings instead. The northeastern holdings had produced more food this winter than in the previous 3 years combined. The wildlings were not merely labor, they were northern labor, which meant they understood the specific cold season agriculture of a climate that made most southern farming techniques useless. They had introduced techniques from north of the wall that the northeastern lords had never seen. The techniques of people who had been farming in conditions that made the north's winters seem moderate. Glover read the numbers. He did not become a wildling advocate. That was not Glover's way. But he became what Jon needed from the northern lords, which was actively not obstructive, better than passively cooperative, and enormously better than the friction he'd been producing. Karstark was harder. Jon rode to Karhold himself. The first meeting did not go well. He had prepared the argument, and Karstark had listened to the argument with the specific patience of a man who had decided he was not going to be persuaded, and who was giving the argument its courtesy hearing rather than its genuine consideration. At the end of it, Karstark said, "My lords have held this land for 800 years. We did not hold it by letting the free folk walk through our neighbors and call it policy." He said it without anger, which was worse than anger. Anger could be redirected. This was settled. Jon rode back to Castle Black. He thought about it for a week. Then he rode back to Karhold. He did not go as the king's representative, or as Ned Stark's son, or as any of the things he was. He went as a man with a question, rather than an argument. The question was this: Karstark's land was not in the northeast. The wildling settlement was not in Karstark territory. The objections Karstark had been making were objections to a neighbor's policy, which was politically legitimate, but practically ineffective given that the neighbor was the crown. What Karstark actually wanted, what the friction was a negotiation toward, was reassurance that the wildling presence in the north was not a precedent for wildling presence everywhere, including Karstark territory. Jon gave him the reassurance. He said, "The northeast is the northeast because it's closest to the wall, and its population is lowest, and its need is greatest. It is not a template for the whole north. It is a specific solution to a specific problem." He said, "The wildlings who settle there become, over time, Northmen, not quickly and not without friction. But the North has always absorbed the people who needed absorbing. That's what the North does with the cold that kills everyone else." Karstark had sat with this. Then, he had said, in the Karstark way of a man conceding a point while making clear that the conceding was calculated rather than convinced, "Your father would have made this argument with honor. You make it with strategy. I'm not sure which is better." Father's arguments were better than his results, Jon said. "I'd rather have worse arguments and better results." Karstark had not smiled, but something in his posture had shifted. The friction reduced. Not because Karstark had been convinced, because Jon had given him a way to stop the friction that didn't require him to publicly change his position, which was the specific kind of solution that men like Karstark could accept, the face-saving exit that produced the useful outcome without demanding the admission of error. Jon wrote to Joffrey about this afterward. He wrote, "The Northern Lords are not obstructive because they're cruel. They're obstructive Because they're afraid of being wrong, and they're afraid of what being wrong costs them. Give them a way to be right about the new thing without having been wrong about the old thing, and most of them will take it. The ones who won't, you manage those differently. Joffrey wrote back, Tywin does exactly this with the small council. I've watched him do it for 4 years and never understood the mechanism. Now I do. Jon wrote back, Jaime taught me the form. Varys taught me the purpose. You just need to find who taught you and give them the credit. Joffrey wrote back, after a longer pause than usual, I think it might have been you. Jon set the letter down and looked at Ghost. Don't read into it, he told the direwolf. Ghost put his head on his paw. Joffrey stayed for 5 days total. On the 4th day, Ed took him on a short ranging, half a day north of the wall, with full escort and obsidian on every man, and Jon's specific instruction that Ed was to turn back immediately if anything moved in a way it shouldn't. Ed returned with the future king of the 7 kingdoms, and the Ed expression of a man who had just had a more eventful afternoon than advertised. Joffrey came back changed in the specific way that the North changed people who went into it. Not broken, not terrified, but recalibrated, the way your eyes recalibrated after a very bright light. He came back understanding that what Jon had been writing in letters for 2 years was not cautious language or political positioning. It was description. He had seen a white, not an encounter. From a distance, close enough to see, far enough to be safe. Ed had made sure of the distance. But Joffrey had seen the specific wrong movement of dead men walking. The blue light where eyes should have been, the cold that came ahead of them like an announcement, and he had seen the obsidian arrow that Ed had put through one at 300 yards and watched it drop. He did not speak about it that night. The next morning, before he mounted to ride south, he found Jon. He said, the Valyrian blades. I'll get them. He held Jon's gaze with the specific Joffrey quality of absolute commitment that was the Baratheon underneath the Lannister training. However many I can. I'll send them north before winter. Thank you, Jon said. Don't thank me. He looked at the wall. I should have come sooner. He rode south. 8 months later, the first Valyrian steel arrived at Castle Black. Not a blade, but 7 of them. Sourced from 3 different houses who had responded to Joffrey's personal appeal. 7 blades of Valyrian steel, oiled and sharp and ancient, each one worth a knight's ransom, and each one now on the belt of the Watch Ranger who had demonstrated the best performance with a blade in training. Jon kept Longclaw. He added 6 more rangers who would take the field with Valyrian steel when the time came, and he trained them himself. Specifically, the specific training that Jaime Lannister had given him, adapted for the cold and the wrong enemy. The enemy that didn't respond to pain, and didn't tire, and didn't know fear. You fought the dead differently from the living. You didn't try to hurt them, you tried to stop them. The goal was not the incapacitation of a living opponent. It was the specific termination of something that was already dead, and that needed to be made more completely dead. Ed supervised the training with the flat Ed observation that this was the most unusual thing he had ever been paid not enough for, which for Ed was high praise. Ned came north in the autumn of 302. He came alone, or as alone as a warden of the north traveled, with 20 men and the specific quality of a man who had been managing logistics at a distance for 2 years, and who had decided he needed to see what the logistics were actually supporting. That was the stated reason. Jon knew there was another. He met Ned at Castle Black's gate, and they stood for a moment in the specific northern silence of 2 people who had not been in the same place for 2 years, and who were doing the specific northern recalibration of seeing each other in person after the letters. Ned looked older. Not dramatically, he had always looked older than his years, the weight of the keeping having worn him in visible ways. But the past 2 years of managing the northern supply chain and riding the holdings and sending ravens to the wall had added something to the wearing. Not grief. Purpose, Jon thought. The specific thing that happened to Ned when he had a clear task, the burden lightened because the direction was clear. You look like the wall, Ned said. I spend most of my time on it. Cold, grey, difficult to move. He held Jon's gaze. I mean it as a compliment. Ghost came around the corner of the gate, and Ned looked at the wolf, and the wolf looked at Ned with the specific Ghost assessment, and then padded over and put his head under Ned's hand. Ned stood very still and put his hand on the wolf's head. He's enormous, Ned said. The North does that, Jon said. They went inside. What followed over 3 days was the most honest conversation Jon had ever had with Ned, which was partly because the distance of 2 years had made honesty easier, and partly because Ned had come north with the specific intention of saying things that letters couldn't carry. He told Jon about the North's political situation, the lords who had cooperated and the ones who hadn't, and the specific difficulties of the wildling settlement that Jon had been managing from a distance, and that had produced, predictably, the friction that any large population movement produced. When it landed in an existing community, he told Jon about Robb, who was becoming the lord the North needed, with the specific Robb quality of making it look natural rather than worked at. He told Jon about the children, Bran's strange dreams, which Ned described carefully with the specific Ned quality of a man taking something seriously that he couldn't fully explain. Arya's training, which had stopped being a source of conflict in the family, because everyone had given up on making Arya do things she didn't want to do, and had redirected the energy into making sure she did the things she chose to do as well as possible. Sansa's court preparation, which was, in Ned's telling, going better than expected, because Sansa had developed the specific skill of learning from observation rather than instruction, and had been observing things that prepared her for politics without Ned intending it. He told Jon about Robert's continued improvement, which was partial and imperfect, but real. Robert drank less, not enough less, but less. He had been twice to the small council in the past year, and both times had brought the Wall's situation to the agenda and refused to let Tywin redirect the discussion. He had, in one meeting, told the assembled council that the Night's Watch was the most important military institution in the realm, and that any lord who felt otherwise was welcome to travel north and explain his position to the dead personally. Tywin had said nothing to this. Jon said, "He'll be all right." Robert, he was always better at results than methods. The Wall is a result. He'll protect it. He talks about you constantly, Ned said, in ways that would have seemed remarkable 2 years ago. He tells people about the conversation in the hunting room, about the godswood. He held Jon's gaze. He calls you Lyanna's boy. He means it as the highest thing he can say. Jon looked at the fire. He gave me 2 years in the most dangerous place in the world and backed every decision I made with the Crown's authority, Jon said. I'd call that fathering, even if neither of us would say it that way. Ned was very still. I didn't do enough of it, Ned said. I kept you safe. I kept the secret. I told myself that was enough, and it wasn't. He held the gaze. You went to King's Landing not knowing who you were, and came back here knowing everything, and I was the reason for both the not knowing and the everything. And he stopped. The specific Ned stopped. I'm proud of you. I've always been proud of you. I should have told you more. Jon held his uncle's gaze. You told me every time you let me train past the other boys, Jon said. Every time you put me at the main table. Every time you said my name as though it meant something. He held the gaze. You told me. You just didn't say it with words. Ned looked at him. That, he said, is the most forgiving thing anyone has ever said to me. You're easy to forgive, Jon said. You always meant well. The meaning well was the thing you got right. The execution was, he almost smiled. The execution needed work. Ned almost smiled back. They sat at the fire for a long time without speaking, the way Stark sat at fires, with the words having been said and the silence now being the rest of what needed to be communicated, which was everything that words were not sufficient for. On the last morning, before Ned rode south, he said, "Come home. When it's done, whatever form home takes by then." He held Jon's gaze. "Winterfell, whenever you're ready. The seat will be there." "I'll come," Jon said. "I promise." Ned rode south. Jon stood at the gate and watched him go. He thought, I have 2 fathers, and both of them are leaving to go manage the consequences of the thing I'm building here, and that is exactly how it should be, and I am not going to examine it more carefully than that. He went back to the ranging reports. 2 months before the cold reached the Wall, a ranging party found what they had been dreading finding. Not whites. Whites they knew how to handle. What Ed's ranging party found in the frozen creek bed 3 hours north of the Wall's eastern section was 8 watch rangers who had not made it back from the previous week's ranging, and who were still moving. 8 risen black brothers. The ranging party came back through the gate in the late afternoon. 2 men short, the 2 who had been in front when the 8 had moved, the 2 who had not had time to use the obsidian. Ed came through last with the specific Ed expression of a man who had just experienced the worst thing he had expected, and who was processing the confirmation that his expectations had been correct. "Confirmed," Ed said to Jon. "They keep the Watch's clothes. They keep the Watch's weapons. They don't keep anything else." He held the gaze. 6 of us with obsidian managed 8 of them. We lost 2 before we understood what we were dealing with. Jon looked at the 2 empty spaces in the returning party. They need to be put down, he said, before they reach populated ground. Already done, Ed said. I went back, finished it. He held the gaze flat. I didn't lose 2 men to leave 8 of them wandering the haunted forest in watch black. Seemed disrespectful. Jon held the flat gaze. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me. It was horrible. Ed went to eat. Jon went to Aemon. The old man was in his cell. As always, the cell warm and dark and smelling of old paper, and the fire that burned lower every year as Aemon's body required less heat and his mind required more light to read by. 8, Aemon said, when Jon had finished the account. 8. In watch clothes. With watch equipment. The equipment is what concerns me. The old man's hands were folded. The dead don't use equipment. The whites you've been encountering use themselves, their bodies, their mass, their cold. But 8 whites with swords and in watch black is something different, something that's using what they carry. They attacked like they knew what a sword was for, Jon said. Ed said they didn't swing like animals. They swung like men who had known how. Aemon was quiet for a long time. The old accounts, he said finally, describe a specific kind of dead. Not whites, not the mass of turned corpses. A different kind, the ones who retained more of what they were. The ones the Night King made rather than simply turned. He held his blind gaze in Jon's direction. The accounts called them his generals, the ones he chose. The ones he preserved with more of the cold's intelligence than a simple white was given. Stronger, more purposeful, Aemon said. Which may be worse than stronger. He paused. What did you do with their bodies? Ed burned them. Good. The papery hands unfolded and refolded. Fire always. Never leave them. He was quiet again. Jon, what I'm going to tell you is from the oldest accounts, the ones from the last long night that the Watch preserved because someone 8,000 years ago understood they might be needed. I've been sitting on whether to tell you because I didn't want to add to what you're carrying before you needed to carry it. Tell me, Jon said. The Night King was not always what he is. He was made. The cold didn't create him. The cold found him. A man of the first men, from the era before the wall, who was transformed by the cold in a specific way that the accounts describe as a bargain rather than a conquest. He held the blind gaze on Jon. I tell you this because the accounts describe how he was unmade the first time. Not killed. The long night ended, but the Night King was not killed. He retreated. He went north again and waited. He paused. The accounts say the retreat happened because of a specific weapon. Not just any Valyrian steel. The weapon of a specific bloodline. Jon was very still. You're talking about Targaryen blood, he said. I'm talking about fire-forged blood, Aemon said. The bloodline that the dragons built. The specific magic of it. Valyrian steel is effective against the cold because Valyrian steel is made with dragonfire, the hot magic meeting the cold magic. But the accounts describe a more complete ending than retreat. They describe a specific moment when the Night King's cold was met by the fireblood directly, and what that produced was not retreat but dissolution. Jon looked at the old man. You're telling me, he said slowly, that the person who needs to end this isn't just the person with Valyrian steel. It's the person with Valyrian steel and Targaryen blood. I'm telling you what the accounts say. Aemon held the gaze. I'm also telling you that you are the only person in the world who has both. Jon sat with this for a long time. You could have told me this earlier, he said. I could have, Aemon agreed. I chose to let you build what you needed to build without the weight of prophecy pressing on every decision. A man who believes he is destined to do a specific thing often makes worse decisions on the path to it than a man who is simply doing what needs doing. He paused. You've been doing what needs doing. I wanted that to remain the thing driving you, not the prophecy. Jon looked at the fire. It changes the plan, he said. The engagement plan. I was going to send the Valyrian Steel Rangers at the Night King's position and provide support, and now you know the support needs to be you, Aemon said. Yes, Mormont will argue against it. Mormont will be correct to argue against it. Risking the person with the most knowledge of the Wall's operations and the most political authority supporting it is a legitimate tactical objection. He paused. And you will go anyway. I was always going to go, Jon said. I know. Aemon almost smiled. I told you. You're exactly what the Wall has been waiting for. Jon stood. At the door he stopped. "Maester Aemon," he said. "Yes, when it's done. When the cold is gone and the wall is standing, I want to write the proper account. Not the ranging reports. The full account. From before I arrived. Everything the Watch has known and documented about the dead, and what we built, and what it cost." He held the gaze. "I want it in the archives, so that if it ever comes back in another 10,000 years, or 1,000, or 100, there is an account that doesn't have to be rebuilt from scraps." Aemon was quiet. "I'll help you write it," he said. "When it's done." Jon left. He changed the engagement plan. The winter of 302 to 303 was the winter the cold reached the wall. Not dramatically. Not all at once. The cold's front edge touched the wall's base in the northeast sector on a night in the second month of winter. And the ranging party that Jon had positioned near the northeastern section sent back a raven that said, "They're here. Northeast, numbers unknown. Cold advance confirmed." Jon was ready. He had been ready for 2 years. The difference between the wall the cold reached and the wall it would have reached without the preparation was the difference between a position that could hold and a position that could not. The wall was not undermanned anymore. It had 1,200 sworn brothers and 600 armed wildlings on the south side, and Mance raiders 10,000 fighters on the north side. The ones who had refused to come over the wall because Mance had decided his people would fight from the north, where they knew the terrain, rather than retreat behind stone and wait. That decision, Mance's decision to fight from the north rather than shelter in the south, was the decision that changed everything. Jon had argued against it. They had argued in the Great Hall of Castle Black for 3 hours. Jon and Mance and Mormont, and the argument was real, and the disagreement was real, and in the end Mance had said, "My people have been running for 2 years. Some of them don't have anything left except the fighting. Let them fight." Jon had said, "If they fight from the north and the cold surrounds them." Mance had said, "Then they die fighting. That's better than dying cold and frightened south of a wall." Jon had looked at the man who had once worn the black cloak and who understood something about choosing your death that Jon did not yet fully understand. And he had said, "Keep your fastest riders as couriers. The moment the cold changes direction, the moment the numbers exceed what you can hold, you come over the wall and you come immediately. No pride, no last stands." Mance had agreed to that. The first engagement was in the northeast, in the specific terrain that Jon had studied for 2 years, the frozen ground and the tree line and the specific approach paths that the cold had been testing for 1 winter. The whites came in the night, as they always came in the night, and Mance's people met them at the tree line with fire and obsidian and the specific courage of people who had been afraid for 2 years and had found that the fear made them faster rather than slower. The cold arrived at the wall's base in the 3rd hour of the night. There was no herald. There was no dramatic build-up, no visible tide of the dead approaching from the north that the wall's watchers saw coming for hours. What there was the wrong cold arriving at the wall's base with the sudden presence of something that had been moving patiently for 2 years and had finally arrived at its destination. One moment, the haunted forest was the ordinary dark of a winter night. The next, the watchers on the wall's top felt the cold shift in register and looked north and saw the tree line change. The wildlings who had come south ahead of this moment had described what the army looked like at distance. The Watch's ranging reports had documented it in pieces. None of the documentation fully carried the specific reality of tens of thousands of whites at the base of a 700-foot wall, the mass of it, the silence of it, the cold radiating off it like the inverse of heat. It was the silence that was the worst part, the watch captain told Jon afterward. The dead didn't shout or drum or announce themselves. An army of living men made noise. The dead made none. They simply were, suddenly and completely, and the silence was the specific silence of things that did not need to communicate because they had no dispute about what they were doing. The wall's watchers sent the ravens. Jon received the raven in the command room where he had positioned himself precisely for this moment, the hub of the communication network, the center of the web that connected the wall to Castle Black to the staging points south to Winterfell beyond. He read the raven's message, and he felt the specific thing that he had been preparing to feel for 2 years, without being able to fully anticipate what it would feel like, which was, "The thing I've been building is about to be tested, and I will know very soon whether the building was right." He sent the ravens, 20 of them, simultaneously, to every position, and every holding, and every lord who needed to know. Then he climbed to the wall's top and assessed. what he saw was not what he had imagined. 2 years of reports had built an image in his mind of the dead as a specific military force, with a specific military disposition, and the image was accurate in its components and wrong in its aggregate. The way all maps were wrong when the territory arrived. The dead were not deployed. They were not in formations. They were the cold made manifest, enormous and patient, and organized in the non-human way of things coordinated by a single intelligence rather than by the cooperation of independent minds. Mormont appeared beside him. The Lord Commander looked north and said nothing for a long moment. Bigger than the reports, Mormont said finally. Yes, the obsidian. Every man below has it. The gate teams have the fire preparations, the pitch and the torches. The southern staging points are alerted. Jon held the gaze forward, north, at the darkness that was too dark. The wall holds them. That's the first fact. The wall's foundation holds them from crossing directly, and it will hold as long as the foundation's integrity holds. How long? Aemon's accounts say the first long night lasted a generation. The cold didn't breach the wall. Eventually it retreated when the Night King retreated. Jon held the gaze. We're not waiting for retreat. We're ending it. Mormont looked at him. The plan. The plan holds. The defense of the wall is yours. The watch. The wildlings on the south side. The fire and the obsidian at the base. My group goes north. He held the Lord Commander's gaze. Your job is to keep the cold's attention on the wall. My job is to give it something else to be attentive about. Mormont was quiet. If you don't come back, Mormont said. Then the wall is still the wall, Jon said. And you hold it. The supply chains are established, the wildling integration is operating, the northern lords are positioned. The structure I built doesn't depend on me being here to maintain it. He held the gaze. I built it that way on purpose. Mormont looked at him with the specific old bear expression that had been developing over 2 years of Jon being both the best thing that had happened to the watch and the most irritating. You've been planning to go north for a month, Mormont said. Since Aemon's account of the bloodline, Jon said. Yes, you didn't tell me. I knew you'd argue against it. I would have argued against it. I know. Jon held the gaze. I need you defending the wall, not arguing with me. The argument would be correct, and the conclusion would still be the same, and we'd have wasted time we don't have. He held the gaze. Hold the wall. Mormont held his gaze for a long moment. Hold the wall, he said. Yes, Ygritte was at the gate when Jon came down. She had organized the wildling fighters on the south side herself, had been organizing them since the ravens went out. The specific Ygritte competence of a woman who had spent 2 years becoming indispensable to an operation she had initially come to as a negotiating partner. She had become, in the specific way that capable people became things when they had room to be them, the functional commander of the wildling contingent on the wall's south side. She looked at Jon with the flat northern assessment. You're going north, she said. Yes, without Mance's fighters. Mance's fighters are on the north side doing what they promised. He held her gaze. My group is 12. Smaller, faster, she held his gaze. The Night King, she said. Yes, she was quiet for a moment. My grandmother said, she said, that the last time the cold retreated it wasn't because of the wall. It was because something went after the center of it. She held the gaze. I didn't believe the story. I grew up north of the wall, and I didn't believe in the Night King as a specific being. I thought it was what the dead were, not who was directing them. She paused. I was wrong. You adjusted, Jon said. That's what the free folk do, she said. We adjust, or we die. She held the gaze. Come back. That's the plan, Jon said. He assembled his 12. Jon was on the south side of the wall. This was the hardest thing of the whole campaign, being on the south side while the fighting was on the north. Because the wall was the wall, and the wall was the line, and his role was not to fight on the north side but to manage what happened on the south side when the north side needed support. He had put himself there by design. Because the south side was where the coordination happened, the ravens, the supply lines, the communication to Winterfell and through Winterfell to the realm beyond. He was the connection between the wall and the world. He was also the man who had been trained for 2 years in Jaime Lannister's yard, and who carried Longclaw, and who every ranging report confirmed was the Watch's best blade with Valyrian steel. And standing on the south side while people were dying on the north side was the specific test of the discipline he had been building since the day he'd walked into King's Landing's training yard and found that discipline was the thing the court ran on. He held the south side. He sent the ravens. He coordinated the supply flows. He wrote the reports. He kept Robb informed, who kept the northern holdings informed, who kept the food and the reinforcements moving. He kept Joffrey informed, whose ravens back to Castle Black in those weeks were the most useful communication Jon received from anyone, because Joffrey had spent the year since his wall visit building the case for the dead with the Southern Lords, and the Southern Lords were now not believing exactly, but positioned to respond when the responding became necessary. The first engagement lasted 3 days. Mance's people held the tree line for 3 days, and then pulled back to a secondary position as the cold numbers increased past what the tree line could hold, and the secondary position held for 2 more days. And then Mance sent the rider over the wall. The numbers are very large. We're coming. They came over the wall in the night. 10,000 wildlings crossing the wall through the gate that Jon had opened for exactly this moment. The largest crossing in the wall's history. A river of people flowing south in the specific way that people flowed when they had been fighting for 3 days, and the fighting was not over. Mance came last. He came through the gate with his sword still drawn, and the specific expression of a man who had made the decision he'd promised he would make, and who did not regret it, and was not going to pretend he did. Jon met him at the gate. "How many?" Jon said. 9,000 made it, Mance said. "The wall is holding. But what's on the north side of it now is very large, Jon. How large?" Mance looked at him. "Thousands," he said. "Tens of thousands of whites." And at the center of it, he stopped. The specific stop of a man who had seen something he was still processing. At the center of it is the Night King. Not a story. The actual thing. I saw him. From distance. He was looking at the wall. He held Jon's gaze. He was looking at it the way you look at something you've been patient about for a very long time. Jon held the gaze. He had known this was the endgame. He had built toward this moment for 2 years with the specific logic of a man who had read every report about what was coming and had not allowed himself to look away from what the reports described. The Night King, the intelligence, at the center of the cold. The thing that directed the dead. He sent ravens. He sent them to Ned, to Robb, to Robert, to Joffrey, to every northern holding and every southern lord that Joffrey had been working for a year. He sent the raven that said, "The wall is under siege. The Night King is at the wall. Every man we have prepared, every blade we have sharpened, every alliance we have built. Now. It's now." He sent the raven to Winterfell that said, "Robb, bring everyone." Then he climbed to the wall's top. He stood at the top of the wall and looked north. It was dawn, and the dawn light showed the north for exactly what it was. The army of the dead was at the tree line, the specific darkness of the wrong cold, the specific stillness of 10,000 things that did not breathe or tire or care about the cold, because the cold was them. And at the center of the tree line, visible from 700 feet only as a figure that was wrong, in the specific way that the Night King was wrong. Wrong cold, wrong still, wrong blue. The intelligence that had been building this army for longer than the wall had been standing. It looked at the wall. Jon looked back. 2 years of preparation. Dragonglass on 1,200 rangers and 600 armed wildlings. 7 Valyrian steel blades on trained men. Robb Stark riding the north with every man who could be spared. Joffrey Baratheon in King's Landing with the Southern Lords finally understanding. Robert's authority, and Ned's logistics, and Mance's intelligence, and Ygritte's courage, and Ed's flat precision, and Aemon's 100 years of patience. Everything he had built. He would need all of it. He went back down. The night the wall was tested, Jon Snow went north, not alone. He went with the 12 rangers who carried Valyrian steel, and with Mance's fastest fighters who had been over the wall twice already and knew the terrain, and with Ghost. He went through the gate that the wall permitted because the wall had been built to allow passage by those who understood what it was for. And the gate opened, and he went through, and the cold wrapped around him like a recognition. The plan was not heroic. Jon had spent his whole life distrusting heroic plans. Heroic plans were plans made by people who believed in the story they were living in, and Jon had never been able to believe in the story without also seeing the failure modes. The plan was specific and mechanical, and it had been built from 2 years of ranging reports and Mance's intelligence and Aemon's historical accounts. And it required the kind of precise execution that the wall's south side could only achieve if it held long enough for the north side to do the work. The work was to find the Night King. The dead were directed by the Night King. Kill the directing intelligence, and the directed thing stopped. The old accounts described this. The ranging reports had suggested it. The withdrawal of whites when a White Walker was destroyed. the specific retreat that Ed had observed and documented. Kill the Night King, and the army died with him. The problem was reaching him. Tens of thousands of whites stood between the tree line and the Night King's position. The wall's 1,200 rangers could not fight through tens of thousands of whites from the north side. What they could do was attract the whites, draw the army's attention to the wall's base, to the attempted crossing, to the fight that would look from the Cold's perspective like the real threat. While Jon's group moved through the darkness of the army's eastern flank, outside the main body, where the Cold was thinner because the Cold concentrated toward the wall. Mance had explained the army's edges to him, where the dead were densest and where they were not. The Night King moved with the army's center, which was also where the densest numbers were. But the edges were permeable, especially at the eastern flank, where the terrain was broken and the tree line ran irregular and the dead had less strategic reason to concentrate. Jon went east. He went east with his 12 and Mance's fighters and Ghost, and they moved through the Cold with the specific trained speed of people who had been preparing for exactly this landscape in the dark. And the dead were there, but not in the numbers of the center, and the obsidian cleared the path, and the Valyrian steel cleared it faster, and Ghost moved ahead of them all. The direwolf in his element, in a way that Jon had been waiting for since the night he'd found him in the snow outside Winterfell. Ghost had always been built for this. Jon understood it now, fully, for the first time. The red eyes in the dark, the absolute silence, the cold that the wolf moved through, as though it were warmth rather than threat. Ghost was not afraid of the dead, because Ghost was the North, and the North was older than the dead's return, and the North had survived the last long night and would survive this one. They reached the Night King's position in the early morning. He was in a clearing at the army's center-east edge, elevated on a frozen rise that served the same function a general's vantage point always served. And he was not alone. 4 White Walkers flanked him, and the dead were thick at the clearing's edges, and the cold that came off him was the wrong cold concentrated to its source. He looked at them when they came into the clearing, not surprised. The Night King was not capable of being surprised in the way humans were surprised, because surprise required the assumption of a different outcome, and the Night King had been building toward this for 10,000 years and had not built a contingency into the assumption. He had not expected an organized opposition. He had not expected Valyrian steel in quantity, or a wall with 1,200 men, or wildlings who had spent 2 years learning to fight rather than run. He had not expected Jon Snow. The 4 White Walkers moved first. Jon's 12 rangers took 2 of them, the obsidian arrows from distance, the same 300-yard shots that Ed had described in the ranging reports. Precise and cold practiced. The White Walkers shattered the way ice shattered, the way the ranging reports had described, the specific crystalline dissolution that the wrong cold produced when Valyrian steel ended it. 2 more walkers were still moving. Jon took one himself. Longclaw was in his hand, and he met the walker's ice blade with a highly taut form that he had adapted over 2 years for the cold and the wrong enemy. The pivot that cost less energy and produced the same result. And when the Valyrian steel connected with the walker's blade shattered, and the walker's form followed. The cold dispersing in the specific silent way it dispersed when it died, and Jon was already moving. The last walker and Ghost arrived at approximately the same moment. Ghost did not use Valyrian steel. Ghost used teeth and the specific weight of a full-grown direwolf in the cold of his element, and the walker's attention divided between the teeth at its flank and the Valyrian blade coming from the front. And the blade won, and the cold dispersed, and 4 White Walkers were gone, and the Night King was alone in the clearing. The dead at the clearing's edges stopped. Not retreated. Stopped. The specific cessation of movement that said the direction had paused. The directing intelligence concentrating on the specific threat in the clearing rather than the broad threat at the wall. Jon faced the Night King. He had a theory about this moment. He had been building it since the ranging reports and Mance's intelligence and Aemon's historical accounts. The specific theory that the Night King was not simply a military threat, but a magical one, and that the magic had a counter, and that the counter was in the blood he carried. Rhaegar's blood. Lyanna's blood. The blood that the prince who was promised mythology pointed at, which Jon had always refused to believe in on principle, and which he now found himself standing inside, sword in hand, in a frozen clearing at the edge of the world. He did not believe in prophecy. He believed in Longclaw, which was real. He believed in 2 years of preparation, which was real. He believed in Ghost, who was at his side, real and white and enormous. He went forward. What happened in that clearing was not a duel in any sense that the songs would recognize. It was not elegant. It was not clean. The Night King was not a swordsman in the human sense. He was a cold intelligence in a human-shaped form, and what he fought with was the cold itself, the directed cold, the weapon of something that had been winter for 10,000 years. Jon had one advantage, which was that the cold was also something that Valyrian steel was made to meet, forged in dragonfire. The opposite of the wrong cold at a physical level. He also had Ghost. Ghost was the thing the Night King had not accounted for. The direwolf did not have Valyrian steel and could not kill what Valyrian steel killed. But Ghost was not trying to kill the Night King. Ghost was trying to move him, to break the cold stillness, to force the directing intelligence out of the positioned stillness that was its strength, and a direwolf throwing its full weight at something that was used to standing at the center of tens of thousands of things that obeyed it was effective in the way that unexpected forces were always effective. The Night King moved. He moved to avoid Ghost, the directional shift Jon had been waiting for, and Longclaw was there. The Valyrian steel connected. The cold that was the Night King shattered. Not slowly, not dramatically. With the specific sudden absence of something that had been a presence, the wrong cold present in the clearing, and then not present, the blue light gone. The impossible stillness replaced by the ordinary stillness of a frozen clearing at dawn, and the dead at the clearing's edges falling as they fell when the direction stopped. The specific collapse of things that had been kept upright by something that was no longer keeping them upright. The army of the dead died. Not all at once. The wall was far enough away that the dying took minutes to reach it, the cascade of the dead falling as the cold withdrew. The wrong cold retreating from the wall's base the way cold retreated when heat arrived. The rangers on the wall's top saw it before they understood it, the front rank of wights at the wall's base going down, then the second rank, then the third, the dying spreading back through the army like a reversal of the tide. By the time Jon came back through the wall's gate, the northeast sector was clear. Mormont was at the gate. He looked at Jon. He looked at Ghost. He looked at the 12 rangers, 9 of whom had made it back, 3 of whom would be buried at Castle Black in the specific northern way of men who died doing the necessary thing. He said, "It's done." Jon said, "For now." Mormont held his gaze. For now, the Lord Commander agreed. The dead fell in 2 minutes. That was the thing that the watchers on the wall's top described afterward. The specific thing that made what had happened real rather than rumor, not the sound, because there was no sound. The dead fell silently the way they had stood silently. But the speed. 2 minutes from the moment the Night King's cold dispersed to the moment the last wight at the wall's base had gone down. 100,000 dead things simply becoming dead things. The distinction between the moving dead and the still dead collapsing in the specific instant that the intelligence directing the motion was removed. The watchers on the wall's top stood for a moment in the specific stunned silence of people who had been braced for a siege of indefinite duration, and who were now looking at a field of fallen things in the pre-dawn dark and trying to recalibrate. Mormont was the first to speak. He said, "Get the gate open." They opened the gate before Jon came through it. He came through in the grey dawn with Ghost at his side, and 9 of his 12 behind him. The 3 who were not behind him were in the frozen clearing to the east, and they would be buried at Castle Black in the same ground as every watchbrother who died doing the necessary thing. The ground that was fuller now than it had been when Jon arrived, and that would hold some of the best men he had. No. He was bleeding. Not badly. The cold's attack on him in the final moment, the Night King's last directed force before the dissolution, had opened a cut along his left arm that was cold and deep, but not arterial. The cold's wounds did something strange to the edges, cauterized them in a way that fire didn't, and they hurt with a specific wrong cold hurt that the maester would spend 2 days treating. He came through the gate, and the yard was full. Every man at Castle Black who was not on the wall or at the staging points was in the yard. The wildling fighters. The Watch Brothers. 900 men who had been prepared for the siege of the wall, and who were now standing in the pre-dawn dark, watching the king's representative come back through the gate with a bloody arm and a direwolf and 8 surviving rangers. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Mormont said, from the gate's edge, in the specific old bear voice that carried without volume, "The Night King is dead." The yard was still for one more moment. Then the noise began. Not cheers. The watch was not given to cheering. The watch had been training itself out of triumph for years, because triumph made you slow, and slow made you dead. It was something else. A specific sound that Jon had not heard before and would not hear again. The sound of 900 men releasing the held tension of a siege that had not arrived yet, of a fear that had been the background of every day for 2 years, of the weight of knowing what was coming and not knowing if you'd be enough for it. The weight was gone. Ghost walked to the center of the yard and sat. The yard quieted. Jon stood at the gate and looked at the men and the wolf and the grey morning and the wall behind him, still standing, still enormous, still ice and old magic and 8,000 years of purpose fulfilled. Moment came to him. The Lord Commander put his hand on Jon's shoulder, the old bear grip. The grip of a man who had been in command for 20 years and who did not make physical gestures without intent, and looked at the arm. "Maester," he said. "In a moment," Jon said. "Let me see the north first." They went up. The wall's top in the dawn was the specific sight that Jon needed before anything else. The haunted forest. The frozen ground. The field of fallen dead between the tree line and the wall's base. Tens of thousands of them, simply down. The wrong cold entirely absent. The north for the first time in 2 years, simply the north. Cold in the right way, the seasonal way. The way it had been before the wrong cold came. He stood at the wall's top, and he looked north until the dawn was fully day. Then he went to the Maester. The Maester's name was Mullen, a young man who had been sent to Castle Black by the Citadel 18 months before in response to one of Jon's letters requesting trained medical support rather than the Watch's traditional approach to wounds, which was primarily stoic endurance. Mullen had not expected to like the wall and had developed a grudging respect for it in the specific way that people developed grudging respect for things they had not expected to need. He cleaned the cold wound and wrapped it and said it would scar, and Jon said he understood that. And Mullen said the cold had done something unusual to the tissue, and Jon said he knew. He sat in the Maester's room afterward, and Ghost lay at his feet, and he was tired in the specific way that was different from physical exhaustion. The tiredness of something that had been suspended finally being set down. Ed appeared in the doorway. "The northeast sector is clear," Ed said. "Rangers confirmed. Nothing moving. The other sectors? Northwest and central, still checking. Early signs are the same." He paused. "We lost 11 men total. 3 from your group. 4 from the wall's base when the dead first hit. 2 at the eastern staging point. 2 more we haven't found yet. They went north before the dead fell and we're looking." "Keep looking," Jon said. "Obviously," Ed said. "I came to ask what you want to do with the fallen ones. The dead that are down. There are a lot of them. Between the wall and the tree line. Someone is going to have to." He made a gesture that communicated the scale of the logistical problem. "Deal with them. Fire," Jon said. "All of them. Don't leave them." "That's what I thought you'd say." Ed looked at him. "That's going to take weeks." "Then it takes weeks." Jon held the gaze. "Every single one. We don't leave the dead to become something else." Ed left. Jon sat in the Maester's room. He thought about 11 men. He thought about 3 in the frozen clearing, and 4 at the wall's base, and 2 at the eastern staging point, and 2 still missing in the north. And he held the specific weight of 11 names against the weight of what would have happened without the preparation. The wall unmanned, the north unprepared, 30,000 wildlings. Dead in the retreat or turned, the northern holdings undefended. The specific catastrophe of the dead reaching a realm that had been told for years the dead were coming, and had refused to believe it until they arrived. 11. He would carry 11. He would write 11 names in the archive with Aemon's help, in the proper account that he had promised to write, and the 11 names would be the specific weight that the account carried from this point forward. He closed his eyes. Ghost put his head on Jon's knee. Jon put his hand on the wolf's head. He slept. The ravens went out that morning. Jon wrote them himself, one by one. To every lord, and every holding, and every person who had been part of the 2 years of building that had produced this morning's outcome. He wrote to Ned. He wrote to Rob, who had been 3 days' ride south of the wall with the northern levies when the final engagement happened, and who had not been needed, which was the best possible outcome. He wrote to Robert, whose letter was long and detailed, and which ended, "The wall held. The dead are gone. You were right to send me north. Tell Joffrey he was right to come." He wrote to Joffrey separately. The blades mattered. Every one of them. "Thank you." He wrote to Mance, 9,000. "Your people held the tree line for 3 days. Tell them." He wrote, last, to Maester Aemon. He wrote, "You said the wall had been waiting for someone sent for the right reason, who came for a different one. I came for Lyanna's memory, and I stayed for this. I don't know if that's prophecy. I know it's what happened. The wall held. The cold is gone. Whatever comes next, the wall held. Aemon's response arrived the next day. It was 4 words. It always was going to. Robert came north again. He came in the summer after the Wall's battle, which was the first summer anyone at Castle Black had wanted to see since Jon had arrived. The summer carrying the specific quality of a season that was ordinary rather than a waiting period. He came with a smaller company this time, just himself and Barristan Selmy and 20 men. The company of a man who had decided that being king meant going to where things had happened, rather than waiting for things to be brought to him. He stood at the wall's base, where the dead had stood. The dead were gone. The bodies had been burned, all of them. Over the 3 weeks following the battle, Ed had organized the burning with the flat efficiency of a man who understood necessary work, and that necessary work was just work. What remained at the wall's base was scorched ground, and the specific absence of something that had been enormous. Robert stood on the scorched ground and was quiet in a way that Robert had been learning to be. The specific quiet that had been growing in him since Jon's arrival. The quiet that Jon had watched develop in increments through the letters and now saw in person, fuller and more settled than when he'd been at the wall before. He drank less. Jon had heard this from Ned, from Joffrey's letters, from the small references in Robert's own letters. Not nothing. Robert would never drink nothing. That was not who he was, and Jon had no desire to change who Robert was, only to change what Robert did with who he was. But the specific drowning quality of the drinking, the specific thing Robert had been doing to himself for 15 years, was less. He had stopped going on the boar hunts. This was the thing that Ned had written about with the specific Ned understatement that communicated significance through what it didn't say. Robert has stopped the boar hunts. He says the forest is for thinking now, not for killing. I don't know what you said to him in King's Landing, but it appears to be holding. Jon had not said anything specific about the boar hunts. He had said, in the hunting room, that the reasons for things were usually wrong, and the doing was what mattered. Robert had apparently heard something in that. He turned from the scorched ground and looked at Jon. "Tell me what it was like," Robert said. Jon told him. All of it. Not the cleaned version. Not the version that the letters had carried. Not the political account, or the strategic account. The specific account. The clearing at dawn. The Night King's specific wrong cold presence. The 4 White Walkers and the 12 men and Ghost. The specific moment when Longclaw connected and the cold dispersed. And the field of fallen dead that the watchers on the wall had watched go down. Robert listened. When Jon finished, Robert was quiet for a long moment. "She'd have wanted to be there," Robert said. "I know. Lyanna, she'd have wanted to be the one with the sword." He held the gaze. "She would have argued with me for a week about whether it should be her instead. She would have been wrong," Jon said. "The blood had to be mine. Not because of prophecy. Because I'm the one who was here, who built what needed building, who knew the ground." He held the gaze. "She couldn't have done it better. But she couldn't have done it instead." Robert held his gaze. "No," he said. "No, that's right." He looked at the wall. "You're more her than I thought you'd be. And also more." He stopped. Started again. "You're what she would have made if she'd been given the time to make something. That's what I see when I look at you. Lyanna, with time." Jon held the gaze. He did not have words for this. He let it be wordless. "I'm going to manage the succession properly," Robert said. Then, unprompted, with the specific Robert quality of deciding to do something and announcing the deciding as the doing, "Joffrey is better than he should have been. Better than I was. He's going to be a good king if I stop spending the next 10 years being a bad one." He held the gaze. "I'm going to try the throne. Actually try it. Not perform it, and not endure it. Try it." "What does trying it look like?" Jon said. "I have no idea," Robert said. "I'm going to find out." He clapped Jon on the shoulder, the Robert clap, still the Robert clap, still not calibrated, still rocking Jon sideways. "Come hunting with me before I go. Not boar, just the forest. Just." He gestured at the trees beyond the wall's south side. "Just the quiet." They hunted. No boars, just the forest, and 2 horses, and Ghost ranging ahead, and the specific Robert quiet that had been growing for 2 years, and that was now, in the summer after the battle, something that felt like peace. Robert rode south 3 days later. He was alive when he rode south. He was alive because the hunting trips had become the thing they should have been, the forest rather than the killing in it, the quiet rather than the performance of recklessness. He was alive because Jon had been north and Joffrey had been better, and Cersei had not had to manage a crisis, and the specific combination of pressures that had been building toward the boar for years had been relieved rather than accumulating. Robert rode south, and he was not the king he should have been, and he was better than the one he'd been, and that was the specific Robert outcome, not transformation, improvement. The particular human achievement of a man who had been his worst self for too long, and had found, late, a way to be something else. He would have years yet. Not enough years, probably. Nothing was ever enough years, but more than he'd had before Jon came north, more than Lyanna's death had left him with. More than a boy in a Winterfell yard and a hunting room conversation and 2 years of letters should have been able to produce. The doing was what mattered. The aftermath was long and complicated and full of the specific difficulties that followed any large event. The wildling settlements needed permanent structure. The northeastern holdings needed governance. The Watch needed men and would always need men. And the political realignment that the battle had forced on the South was something that the South was only beginning to process. Lords who had not believed in the dead and who had not provided support were now confronted with the reality that they had been wrong, and that the realm had survived because other people had been right, which was an uncomfortable position for powerful men, and which produced the specific political difficulty of people who needed to acknowledge error and were looking for ways to do it without appearing weak. Jon let them find their ways. He had spent 2 years learning the court's specific patience with the gap between what people believed and what the evidence said, and he applied that patience now to the gap between what the lords wished they had done and what they were prepared to do going forward. He did not demand acknowledgement. He did not perform triumph. He wrote reports and he answered letters, and he continued doing what he had been doing, which was paying attention to the North and asking for what the North needed. Ygritte found him at the wall's base 3 days after the battle. He was there for the practical reason, overseeing the burning of the dead, which was taking longer than he'd hoped and requiring a specific management of wind direction and fuel supply that was unglamorous and necessary, and which he was doing himself, because asking other people to do the unglamorous necessary thing while you stood in the office reading reports was the kind of leadership that the wall couldn't afford. She had a report for him. Intelligence from the wildling scouts she'd sent north after the battle. The ones who had gone over the wall to assess the cold's withdrawal and to confirm what the wall's watchers had been reporting. Gone, she said. The scouts went to the Fist of the First Men. 3 days north. Nothing. No cold. No whites. No wrong. She held his gaze. The trees. Birds. A deer. One of the scouts said he cried. He'd never seen a deer north of the wall. The cold had eaten all of them 2 winters ago. She paused. They're coming back. The animals. The birds. The normal cold. It's coming back. Jon looked at the wall of scorched ground and the methodical burning teams and the sky above the wall that was, for the first time in 2 winters, simply grey, rather than wrong grey. How long for the scouts to reach the lands of always winter, he said. They won't, Ygritte said. Nobody's ever come back from there. Whatever is at the center of the always winter, she paused. The scouts said the cold felt retreated rather than dissolved, like it went back to where it came from rather than vanishing. Imman said it might not be permanent, Jon said. The historical accounts say the Night King was contained the first time, not destroyed. This time I had Valyrian steel and he stopped. He had not told anyone about Aemon's account of the bloodline. He had not performed his Targaryen identity at the wall, had never used it as a credential, had kept it exactly where he kept most things that were personal, in the private space where they could be examined rather than deployed. The blood, Ygritte said. He looked at her. The free folk have stories too, she said. Older than the Watch, older than the Wall. The stories about the last time, they say it was ended by someone who carried both kinds of fire. She held his gaze. Winter and summer, cold and heat. The stories say the one who ended it was made of both. She held the gaze. You're the Winter Stark and the Fire Dragon. That's what the stories are about. I don't believe in stories, Jon said. Neither do I, Ygritte said. But you went north with Valyrian steel, and the cold dissolved, and the dead fell. Whatever you believe about it, that happened. She paused. The free folk will have a story about it for 10,000 years. I'd rather the story be accurate. What story will they tell? She looked at the wall, and the burned ground, and the sky above. that someone came from the south who had been north all his life, who built what needed building, and went north when the cold came, and came back through the gate in the morning with a bloody arm, and a white wolf, and 8 men. She held the gaze. That the wall held because someone was paying attention. That the north survived because someone had the patience to prepare before the thing arrived to prove the preparation necessary. She looked at Jon. That's the story. It's not a prophecy. It's just what happened. Good, Jon said. Make sure they tell it that way. Ygritte nodded. She went back to her scouts. Jon watched her go. He thought, the free folk and the north are not so different. Both of them were always northern. The wall between them was the thing that had needed to end, and the dead had ended it more effectively than any political agreement could have. He went back to the burning. Sam arrived at Castle Black the month after the battle. He came from the Citadel, which was where Mormont had sent him, in the year before the cold reached the wall. When it had become clear that the watch needed a trained maester, rather than just Mullin's excellent but general medical knowledge, Mormont had made the specific decision that Sam Tarly, who had come to the wall as a third son nobody wanted, and who had become the most learned person Jon had ever met outside Aemon's cell, should go to the Citadel and come back wearing the chain. Sam had not wanted to go. Sam had argued about going in the Sam way that was simultaneously intellectually rigorous and emotionally transparent. He had reasons, good reasons, and underneath the reasons the actual thing, which was that he didn't want to be away from the wall when whatever was coming arrived. Jon had overruled him. He had said, the wall needs a maester who understands what we're fighting. The Citadel can give you the chain in a year if you focus on what you need from it. Come back and be the maester who knows. That's more useful than another sword. Sam had gone. He had come back in the month after the battle, riding up to Castle Black's gate with 2 new links in his chain, and the Sam expression of a man who had been away during the most important thing, and was processing the being away as a grief, even as he understood it had been the correct choice. He found Jon in the archive. Jon was writing. He had been writing for 3 weeks, the proper account that he had promised Aemon, sitting in the archive with the ranging reports and Aemon's annotations, and the specific task of turning the chaotic events of 2 years into a document that would mean something to someone 8,000 years from now who needed to know what had happened. Sam sat down across from him without being invited, which was the Sam way when Sam was in a room with someone he trusted. You're writing it, Sam said. I promised Aemon. Can I help? Jon looked up. He looked at his friend, at Sam, who had survived the Great Ranging in a different way in this world, who had survived it by being away at the Citadel rather than by going north and living through the horror of it, and who carried that specific not quite survival with him the way survivors of different things carried their variations. I was counting on it, Jon said. They wrote together for 2 months, Jon and Sam, in the archive at Castle Black. Aemon joined them in the evenings, the old man in his chair by the fire, his memory supplying the specific details that the ranging reports had abbreviated and that the histories had obscured. The 3 of them built the account that Jon had promised, the systematic record of the dead's advance, the wall's preparation, the wildling integration, the Valyrian steel, the Night King's specific nature, and the specific nature of what had ended him. Sam insisted on including the failures. You can't write a useful account and only put in the victories, Sam said. The failures are the teaching. If someone 8,000 years from now has to face this again and they only have a record of the victories, they'll build toward victory rather than building toward not failure. And not failure is the thing that matters. Jon looked at him. Put the failures in, Jon said. Sam put the failures in. The 11 names. The 8 Watch brothers who had risen and needed to be put down again. The wildling camp that had been lost before the integration reached it in time. The 2 northern holdings that had refused to cooperate and that had been left exposed when the wildlings in their area needed shelter and hadn't been given it and had died for it. The account was not a triumphant document. It was an honest one. When they finished, Aemon held the first page and let his fingers read the raised letters that Sam had pressed for him, and the old man sat for a long time. Good, he said. This is good. He set the page down. This is what I stayed for. Not the wall, not the battle. This, the knowing that the next time, if there is a next time, someone will have the whole account and not pieces of it. Jon looked at the old man. There won't be a next time, he said. Not for generations. Generations is not never, Aemon said. But I'll take generations. He paused. I am very old, Jon. I have been at this wall for 60 years. I've been waiting for the specific thing that happened at this wall for 60 years, and it happened, and I was here for it. He held the blind gaze toward Jon. I am ready, now, to rest. Whenever the gods decide. Jon held the gaze. Don't rest yet, he said. I still have questions. You always have questions. Aemon said. It's your best quality. Keep asking them. Sam caught Jon's eye across the table. Sam was smiling in the specific Sam smile that existed underneath the anxiety and the earnestness. The smile that said, this is the life I wanted when I had no life to want. This, the books and the work and the friends at the table who needed the specific things I know how to give. Jon held Sam's gaze. Thank you, Jon said, for going to the Citadel when I asked you to. I know, it was hard. It was very hard, Sam said. The Citadel's politics are almost as bad as King's Landing's, and the food is worse. He paused. But the chain is real, and the knowledge is real, and I can do more with both than I could have done without them. He held the gaze. You were right to make me go. I usually am, Jon said. You are, which is deeply irritating, Sam said, but I've decided to forgive it. Robb came to Castle Black in the spring. He rode up with the specific Robb quality of a man who had been 3 days' ride south and who had not been needed, and who had mixed feelings about not being needed. Because the older feeling was relief, and the younger feeling was the specific Robb thing of wanting to have been there. He stood with Jon at the wall's base and looked at the northeast sector where the dead had been, and where now there was simply the empty north, the haunted forest quieter than it had been in 2 years. You did it, Robb said. We did it, Jon said. The whole north did it. You did it every time you rode a holding and convinced a lord to pre-position food. Ned did it with the supply chains. Joffrey did it with the Valyrian blades. He held his brother's gaze. You weren't 3 days' ride south by accident. You were there because someone had to be ready if the wall needed the north behind it. And you were that someone. That's not a small thing. Robb was quiet for a moment. We've been corresponding for 3 years, Robb said. Letters about logistics and supply chains and wildling movements. We've been running a war together at 300 miles of distance, and we haven't actually talked. He held Jon's gaze. I want you to come home. I know. Father said to ask. Mother said. He stopped, the specific Robb stop of a man conveying a message that surprised him. She said to tell you that Ned's children don't forget who stood with them. All of Ned's children. Jon held the gaze for a moment. I'll come, he said. Give me 2 months. The watch needs to settle. The wildling integration has loose ends, and Mormont needs to know the structure well enough to maintain it without me in it every day. He looked at the wall. But I'm coming back. This isn't finished in the sense of done. The dead are gone, but the wall still needs to exist. The wildlings still need the northeast holdings. The supply chains still need maintaining. He held Robb's gaze. Winterfell is home. The wall is where I work. Father said you'd say that. Ned usually knows what I'm going to say. He said it with the specific tone of a man who was pleased, Robb said. Not resigned. Pleased, Jon looked at the tree line and the birches. The birches he'd forgotten were there. The ones the haunted forest had always had underneath the wrong dark. Still there now, that the dark was gone. Tell Mother I'll be there in 2 months, he said. Tell her who helped. What it took. Tell her about Ygritte and Mance and Sam and Ed and the 11 names. Tell her the whole thing. He held Robb's gaze. And tell her that at the end of it, the thing I thought about most, after the 11 names, was the family. Tell her that. Robb held the gaze. She'll cry, Robb said. Let her, Jon said. She's earned it. They stood at the wall's base in the spring morning, and the north was quiet, and the cold was the right cold now. The ordinary cold. The seasonal cold of a world that had come back to its proper temperature. The wrong cold was gone. The wall held. Jon Snow stood at the base of the wall that he had not been sent to save, but had saved anyway. For reasons that were wrong, and then right, and then larger than either. For Lyanna's memory, for Robert's grief. For 2 years of King's Landing that had taught him how rooms worked. For Ned's logistics, and Robb's rides, and Joffrey's Valyrian blades, and Sam's letter that had never stopped mattering, and Mance's intelligence, and Ygritte's courage, and Ed's flat reports, and Aemon's 100 years of patience. For all of it. The wall was old, and the wall was ice, and the wall had been built by people who understood, better than most who came after, that some threats required preparation rather than belief. and that preparation required someone willing to do the work before the threat arrived to prove the necessity. Jon Snow had been that someone. He had not been sent to be that someone. He had been sent for a dead woman's eyes and a king's grief, and the specific, enormous logic of Robert Baratheon wanting to do something about the only piece of Lyanna Stark that remained in the world. The reasons were wrong. The doing was what mattered. Somewhere in the northeast holdings, 30,000 wildlings were becoming Northmen, slowly and imperfectly, the way all integration happened. Not cleanly, and not without friction, but genuinely. The two peoples of the north finding the specific commonality that cold and survival and shared enemies produced when the common enemy was real enough to make the other differences small. Somewhere south of the neck, Joffrey Baratheon was learning to be a king in the specific way that Joffrey had been learning everything since the Northern Ward had spent 2 years in the Red Keep. Not perfectly, and not without the old Joffrey surfacing sometimes, but better than he would have been, consistently and provably better, the improvement as real as any document in the archive. Somewhere in Dragonstone, Stannis Baratheon was holding a record that might matter again someday, and that he had earned the right to hold by being the person who had provided the obsidian when asked directly by someone who treated him as a practical problem rather than a political obstacle. Somewhere in a hunting room, Robert was sitting by a fire with the wine held rather than drunk, and somewhere very far to the east, across the narrow sea, a silver-haired young woman with dragons was building something else. A different kind of fire, a different kind of claim, a different problem for a different time. That reckoning would come. Most things came eventually, but it was not this day. Ghost pressed his head against Jon's hand, and Jon put his hand on the direwolf's head, and the north was quiet, and the wall was behind them, and the spring was coming, and somewhere to the south a family was waiting for a visit, and somewhere in the east Daenerys Targaryen was building a different kind of fire, and somewhere in every hold and tower and hall of the Seven Kingdoms people were learning, slowly and imperfectly, that the thing they had not believed was real. Not everything was resolved. It never was. But the dead were gone, and the wall was standing, and the north was alive, and that was enough. That was, for now, enough.